So, you guys are listening to the Blockchain Socialist podcast, and for today's interview, I'm very excited. I'm with Stacco Troncoso and Natalia Avlona. They are two members of the group that is working on creating DisCOs, which stands for Distributed Cooperative Organization, and it is a feminist, cooperative, and commons-oriented alternative to the mainstream DAOs, or Decentralized Autonomous Organizations. So, how are you both doing?
We're still alive in 2021, which is quite an achievement.
Still alive. Cold weather where I am. Hoping for 2022. Yeah, thinking a lot about like the care work, like each of us and as members of communities have been taking over for the past 2 COVID years.
Yeah, I know you both have been working quite a lot since it's taken us a while to get us together in at one time, because you guys have been asked to do so many different presentations and talks I could see. But maybe just to start off, could each of you give just a brief introduction to yourself and how you ended up at the DisCO?
We met at the Museum of Archaeology in Athens, and we had like a good conversation in the prehistory of DisCO. DisCO comes from the actual practices of a cooperative, which I co-founded with my partner Anne-Marie Utraitel in 2013, called Guerrilla Translation. And guerrilla translation arose of the practices of the 15M/Occupy / 2011 movement, also present in Greece, which is where Natalia is from. And we wanted to take some of our activism to the workplace and mix in some of the innovations that we were seeing around peer-to-peer interactions, commons, etc., in something that was centered around our productive capacities, what is popularly known as work, and kind of putting activism where we feel it belongs, which is in the workplace, where you're going to spend a third of your life. So out of that, and I worked then with the P2P Foundation, we implemented a lot of the stuff that was being theorized and abstracted in the foundation in real life. So we had first-hand experience of what worked for us, what didn't work for us. And out of that, we always say that DisCOs didn't come from white paper. They came from laughter, tears, and all the panoply of feelings that you can have in life applied to activism in the workplace and applied to engaging with technology, engaging with feminisms, etc. And DisCO is what we do now. We've open sourced the protocol, and we're in this process of getting feedback on how people are adapting it, etc.
It's great. Yes, it was. We met in the Archaeology Museum, and if I remember well, it was 2015, but maybe it was 2016. So I joined DisCO as a member and as a participant and as an observer 1.5 years ago. But we knew each other for a long time because I was also around commons and activist movements in Greece the previous years, like let's say the decade of the recession. So I was mostly active on digital commons and feminist perspective, feminist ethics, and techno-feminism around digital commons because we wanted very much to tackle all this techie, Eurocentric, masculine approach to hackerspaces in Greece and in general at that point of time. And I was also a member of a cooperative in Athens, and which was part of the greater social solidarity movement that the last years in Greece and in Europe was emerging and was having more discussions with the commons-based peer production and the commons movements. So it was a quite optimistic point of time for us whilst in recession. So right now I'm based in Copenhagen. I am a PhD researcher in the computer science department, whilst my background has been in law. And I'm looking at the ways that value is ascribed into data and data-driven design. And I'm very, very much looking into alternative forms of data uh, approach and perspective. So looking more towards like what should be and what could be a relational approach to data in terms of the legal foundation of data protection and data governance. And we have been having an ongoing discussion with DisCO for like 2 years now about what would care ethics mean, and how care ethics can go beyond like the ethics discussion into more applied framework in terms of work, and what do we actually mean by work in a post-capitalist initiative. And this discussion has been also transferred into the realm of DAOs. That Stacco will talk more about it. And I'm looking more into the ways that care ethics can be applied into the way we conceive like data and their legal foundation, and the ways that care ethics can also be applied into the design of the data-driven economy.
Sure. Well, maybe I think it could be really helpful for some people if you could explain a bit some of these concepts that you were talking about as a, because I think that'll be form a good foundation for how we understand like why discos are well, why we wanted to, you guys wanted to create disco as a framework, as an alternative. So like I heard you say things like care ethics, there's care work, feminist economics. These are all things that are maybe not not yet quite mainstream concepts for people. So sometimes when they hear it, they may not know what that means. So maybe we could explain a bit what are some of these like fundamental concepts to thinking about discos.
Um, I will start just with talking a bit about my um, most inspirational and foundational feminist theory, Federici, and then I will give the floor uh, to Stacco. Okay, so I mean, for us, care ethics is something that it's much more complicated than feminism, whilst feminism is a complicated thing. And we don't really want to approach like the diversity in a sense of add more women and stir. Uh, if this has to do with blockchain, if this has to do with cooperatives, if this has to do with common space peer production. So it goes deeper, and it goes deeper into the discussion of Marxist feminists, and particularly Federici, who has been like um, very militant and has done a lot of work to explain that commons cannot really exist without feminisms. And like she really centered like the discussion on the commons, like back into the 70s, Silvia Federici, into the sphere of reproduction. So for Marxist feminists and the feminists the 70s, like the sphere of reproduction, the private sphere was what we should aim for, like restructuring, because it includes all the affective work, the domestic work, all the work that like women have been doing for their children, for the elderly, for the sick, even like for the neighborhood or the community. And this work has been highly invisible and undervalued. And whilst it's the most essential work for our survival and for our social reproduction, and this became like really, really obvious during the last 2 years of the pandemic. So the discussions, like the feminist discussions from the 70s, really came up into the forefront and saw their importance like within the COVID crisis. So her argument is that like the commons can be a structural alternative to capitalism only if we are able to revise these two spheres, like, and the way we conceive the public sphere, which is the sphere of like the work, and the private sphere, which is the sphere of social reproduction, and where work is taking place there and is not visible or is not considered as work. So this means like we need to really rearrange and reevaluate the way we consider work, and the way we define care work into the community and the commons. So, like, where does like the work of the commons, where does the work of the communities belong? Does it belong into the public sphere, or does it belong into the private sphere? So for Federici and for us, the whole idea is that we need to rename and to restructure like the way we vision work within these two spheres, and to go beyond this. So I just now want to give the floor to Stacco after this small historical introduction.
I don't have much to add. I think that you've explained it perfectly. What was said is that these concepts are not mainstream as concepts, but as realities and as practices, they're totally mainstream because I don't know, we tend to talk about network topologies, yeah? So you are the blockchain socialist. So how does socialism work in a blockchain? Well, it has to do with value accounting. It has to do with value sovereignty and the recording of those new values. If those new values are not incorporated in feminist theory, they're really missing out in some of the most exciting innovations of Marxism in the last century and a half, I would say. And one of the foundational texts of feminist economics is Marilyn Waring's What If Women Counted? So, what if women counted? What things would we make visible as concepts that would lead to like the design of new economies? So, in DisCO, I mean, DisCO is an alternative to DAOs, but it's not just an alternative to DAOs because that would kind of like put DAOs in the privileged position of being whole universes on their own, and of DisCO just being a derivative of that.
I want to ask, could we see it as well as, I guess, maybe complementary, like a complementary critique, I guess, a bit. I have because I mean, a few DAOs that I've seen have been really interested in DisCO as well from my research.
It can be, I mean, in our opinion, it can be a precondition for the design of DAOs, and also to take into account like the topologies of decentralization are never just based on how nodes interact with each other and just basically computer-based topologies. There are bodies beyond those computers that have affective, intellectual, and other kinds of needs. And DisCO, I mean, we can get into like some of the differences between DAOs and DisCOs. But the important thing is that DisCO is much more than an alternative to DAOs because it's a melting pot, to use the Gibson Graham term, of alternative economies. So DisCO interfaces with and attracts with publics, people from DAOs. It attracts people from the social and solidarity economy, from cooperatives, people coming more from the commons and peer to peer, and offers a lexicon where we can have like a fruitful dialogue of be realistic about the prospects of technology and be very critical about how we design our technologies, which may be with the best intentions, but may unwittingly reproduce some of the stuff that has been criticized, yes, from feminist economics, from 20th and 21st century Marxism, etc. It's important to give a space to these critiques.
And yeah, when I was just thinking when you were saying that, like, socialism on the blockchain, if that is a thing, if that could ever exist in our wildest dreams, then it would obviously have to think about very, very hard what types of value we are accounting for, and it would very obviously have to move beyond just, I guess, our sort of monoculture of financial value that we have under capitalism. So I think that was a very interesting point. But yeah, maybe we can start to talk about what exactly is a DisCO. We're not talking about, of course, like the place where we go dancing, although maybe there are some similarities.
Yeah, I mean, not to overextend the metaphor, it's a place where you mix together and where you get to express yourself in non-linear ways. It depends on how funky your dancing is. But I mean, DisCO.coop is a set of, it's basically 7 principles to reimagine economies. And they're constraints. I mean, they're constraints on your creativity, on how to reimagine economies, but they're very creative. And for us, it's a process. So, again, whether you're a co-op, whether you're thinking of like starting a DAO, you can question with your group. There are these 7 DisCO principles, and these are like challenges, and we don't have the answers. I mean, we have the answers that in our own economic experimentation we came up with, but we want other people to offer answers. We're in a very critical decade. I think that it's the end of the world as we know it, and not of all of us feel fine. And out of this desperation, you see various reactions. I mean, you see fascism, which is the not new reaction of blaming the other for the social ills, and that kind of like invisibilizes the responsibilities of capitalism in perpetuating inequalities and environmental destruction. You see a really strong tendency now in conspiracy theorizing, which makes an abstract other and throws out science and throws out like a lot of the research in political economy that has been offered, and again invisibilizes capitalism. So we want to offer like a proud anti-capitalist alternative that is not coy. It's not social entrepreneurship. It's not coy about like being like, it's fine. We have an economic system. It's called capitalism. It does not mean markets. It means, it's basically three things: private ownership of the means of production, wage labor, and orientation towards profit. But lo and behold, there's this thing called cooperatives where I mean, there's cooperative ownership of the means of production. There's no wage labors. There are worker owners, and the orientation is towards the co-op, not towards the accumulation of profit. So how can we make this orientation be expanded towards the challenges that we tackle nowadays? So DisCO gives you the initial provocations for you to, with your group. I mean, we always say it takes two to tango, but it takes three and four to DisCO, to answer these provocations and then apply them in your own specificity. And then we would ask you, document it, talk to us, and talk with us, sorry, and then we will develop the tools to make this goes happen.
Stacco has said pretty much everything. I just wanted to raise like a more kind of abstract point on what you said about the value and how value is perceived nowadays in DAOs and blockchain. And there are so many assumptions in the way we have been using and ascribing the idea of value into the circulation of data and the extraction of data. And we tend to forget that like the ways that like economic value, the contemporary economic value, is linked with other values like moral values, and economic value is reflecting moral values of the society each time and each era. And at the same time, like we we tend to forget like that we try to replace like politics with business, as Nathan Sneidner said into a very interesting article like really recently. And this is the case of blockchain. So we tend to make assumptions on the neutrality and objectivity of the value that data behold, and we don't really question how this value is constructed and how this value is extracted, because data are not a thing and data do not exist out there. Data are extracted so through kind of different mediums and data analytics, and they are classified by the interest of the big tech. So there are a series of assumptions out there, and it's interesting for us to talk about them, and it's interesting to find ways to tackle them. Because if we don't really understand that like what is extracted is actually the essence of like the people's interaction, the interaction we have between us, then we can't really find a way to figure out what a different way to understand value and what a different way to produce value would be. And DisCO is exploring like an alternative governance model, which also addressing some of the problems and the lacks that we had in digital commons and common based peer production. Common based peer production was an alternative model of producing value, but it never really had a governance model, and that was the problem. And there was never the provision of what does it happen with the people's contribution, because we have been heavily relying on the voluntary contribution of all of us, or the people who have been contributing, for example, in Wikipedia, like in the entries. But if we want to make this, like if we want to talk about scalability, or if we want to talk about expansion, then we have to really figure out like the survival, the social reproduction of these people who have been contributing into these initiatives, into digital commons, into commons based peer production. So DisCO does this. and it's kind of like offering like a more holistic and alternative governance model for this. And this government models is tackling this idea that like we do things for living and we do things for our social reproduction, and the second things we do are not visible. And within the second sphere, we also do our voluntary activist work. So what it does, it actually tries to say that no, like we need to find a third section, a third way to be able to bring visibility to the activist work, but not to monetize it in a way that is like is perceiving value in the current way. We need to find different ways to value the work that is done in our activist lives.
No, I mean that's you're absolutely right, and there's also like a privilege with engaging, whether it's with DAOs or with commons-based peer production. Is do you have the time? Do you have the cognitive bandwidth to engage with this, as opposed to being able to make a living? So again, if we want to prototype new economic systems, we don't want this to be led by a hacker class, to use the Mackenzie Ward term. We want it to be led by all the stakeholders. I mean, all the people, and also gathering inputs as we can from the non-human world into these new economic designs. With commons-based peer production, this is kind of like the proto mode of production that we find in something like the VLC media player, open source projects like Linux, Apache web server, or indeed Wikipedia. And there's this persistent assumption that commons and commons-based peer production are the same thing, and they're not. Commons-based peer production are usually pseudonymous, large-scale, over-the-internet artifacts which thrive on permissionless, much like public blockchains or many DAOs. It's like you just need like access and to follow the preset governance to contribute. So this is like many-to-many contributions. Commons are more intimate affairs, and at least according to Ostrom, they have very clear boundaries. So boundaries versus permissionless. There's very different relationalities where most of your interactions are taking place through the abstraction of algorithms and the machine, or when your interactions are actually human based, and then after that learning process you interact with the algorithms, but you don't interact as a lonely agent. Yeah. So that's another of the distinguishing factors that I would say are quite important to note.
Hey everyone, if you're enjoying this episode so far, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, share with a friend, and join the crypto leftist communities on Discord or Reddit, which you can find links to in the show notes. If you're enjoying the interview or find the content I make important, you can pitch into my efforts starting at $3 a month on patreon.com/theblockchainsocialist to help me out and join the newest patrons like Joel, Henry, and Paul. Any amounts really help since making this stuff isn't free in terms of money or time. As a patron, you'll get a shout out on an episode like I just did and access to Patreon exclusive contents like Q&A episodes. You can submit and vote on questions you'd like me to answer, and I'll give my thoughts in roughly 20 minutes. Of course, I'll still be making free content like this interview to help spread the message that blockchain does not need to be used to further entrench capitalist exploitation if we put our efforts into it. So if that message resonates with you, I hope you'll consider helping out. But thanks a lot, and let's get back to the interview. If we're comparing a DisCO to a DAO, what I definitely notice is that a DisCO has a more clear political definition, I guess, than a DAO does, or political economic definition, maybe you could say. Whereas a DAO, I feel like there was this idealized vision of what a DAO could be. If we think back maybe like 5, maybe even now 10 years ago, that it was the idea of just like smart contracts running everything, and that there's no human involved, and like it's just a completely, to them, autonomous meant automated a bit. And it was just like, for me, it just felt like, I just own a company, except I have no workers because it's all automated. And that was like, I think, where a bit that the idea came from for a lot of these like earlier thinkers. But now, as we're getting closer and closer, especially particularly recently in the past couple of years, the definition of DAO has like really, really shifted, I feel like, to where before people used to think, we can solve all of these governance problems by just improving our engineering, or like, if we just like engineer the perfect smart contract, we can sort of like let it happen. But now what you're seeing more and more is people talking about, the culture layer, or some people will say layer 0, where they're finding out that actually, talking to the people who are part of your organization is actually really, really important. and that a lot of difficulties pop up, especially regarding money and regarding like how we pay each other for work and how we value the type of work. And so I feel like I guess in the way that when I say I want to ask this question, how do DisCOs like overtly differ from DAOs? But the problem is that DAO it's an ever-changing definition depending on like the particular moment and like the particular group of people who are a bit most prominent in talking about DAOs.
Yeah, it's a little bit like when they ask us what is the difference between like a cooperative and a DisCO. Well, like a cooperative is a legal structure. It doesn't tell you what it does. Apparently, there's a cooperative in Scotland that designs missile guidance systems. Sure, it's a co-op. The workers are very well treated, but where they put in their productive capacity is not the best thing. The best thing, sorry. A DAO is an algorithmic structure instead of a legal structure, which scurries to find legal structures to uphold it, but it doesn't tell you what the DAO does. And yes, circa, I don't know, I would say like 2014, 2016, and then the collapse of the DAO with the article and the disillusionment goes to show you cannot sanitize human messiness. And in fact, human messiness may be a fertile ground for doing things. So, I mean, just to go over some of the focusing on the DisCO versus DAO contrasts, and again with the caveat that DisCO is not just an alternative to DAOs. It's a lot more because DAOs are not the end of the world. Again, what are the politics? What are the values reproduced in DAOs? Well, here are some values that we propose to you. DisCOs are relational. DAOs are transactional. In DisCOs, they're based on trust. DAOs do away with trust by putting it in the algorithm. In DisCOs, the economic information of the value streams that we have is used for visualization and to have richer conversations on how to do economic experiments. In DAOs, the self-executing contracts there's this, again, this is a caricature, but we do see this happening, is if we get the math right, then the smart contract will auto-execute rewards and punishments. And there's no human discussion on like how can we make this better. I think that DAOs are also like very self-referential. They tend to like prime the idealism of the algorithm rather than the base reality, and the value creation. Value creation to do what? Who's going to do the actual, get their hands dirty to do the work with the capital that is raised by DAOs? And that's something that gets left out of the conversation. So this goes to our way to design better DAOs and to offer a critical way to engage with value sovereignty that goes away from technocracy. And technocracy is what we find in mainstream economics. For example, like after the 2008 crisis, where in Europe, at least, the European Central Bank was, hand appointing presidents, and the Mario Montis, etc. And they were technocrats. Why? Because lay people or the lumpen proletariat, they're not smart enough to understand economics. And we're not smart enough to understand economics because modern economics are totally abstracted and predicated on creating fictitious value. How far away is that from some of the use cases that we've seen in the DAO space? How much is it part of our technocracy, and who's the new DAOist class that is designing these systems in the name of decentralization? And we'll say again, like, decentralizing what? Are we decentralizing the technologies of oppression, which is capitalism, the patriarchy, and colonialism, or are we only decentralizing topology based on token access? And again, I'm painting like a caricature, but I think that it's important to contrast these things because, again, with the optimistic visions of DAOs, we can go back to 1996 and the internet. Like at the beginning of a film, what could possibly go wrong? Well, a lot went wrong when economic interests went in. And with DAOs in particular, I feel that if they become mainstream or they become a tool for oppressive governments and regimes to algorithmically enforce things away from what is traditionally established jurisdiction, we can get into like some very serious trouble. And again, once the money comes in, once the power comes in, we have to just say like, okay, this is a DAO, this is
And also,
an algorithmic
sorry.
structure, but this DAO is mediated
And
by
also
DisCO
like there
principles and discussed at the human level before we go into the design level.
Sorry, I'm in the kitchen in my flat, and like my flatmate just dropped in. Okay, so I was trying to say that actually I was in a discussion very recently, and I heard like the statement that DAOs enables decentralized communities to compete with the big tech. So as Taco said, we had the same story with like the internet, like 1996, and like we have put all this hope and optimism into decentralization, and it proved out that it was like very problematic, and we didn't really like this. We also is a problematic, so people didn't really count on like the interests of the big tech. And I'm feeling that something similar is going to happen, because right now there is this narrative that only the small startups or the medium like enterprises are using DAOs, and this is like very very emancipative for them. And but we we obviously like big tech is going to get into the game very soon, and it will kind of like enclose like nodes of like this decentralized mechanism. And another point that I wanted to raise, like this, the context is the context of DAOs. Like we can't really talk about DAOs as a universal, like automated mechanism that we can apply it anywhere and it will automate everything with like strong objectivity. This is not the case. Like this is not the case at all. Like situations are highly contextual. We have to take this into consideration. And also, I mean, humans are mess and humans have flaws. So this idea that we can, through like these smart contracts, we can actually bypass like the human flaws into something that is better and like more objective. What does this even mean? And like one example is like if you want to replace like if you want to replace in a bank the way that the loans are given to people, and you replace the person who is responsible to give the loan to a citizen, then what do you do by this? Like does the person feel that like the result on what he's been given, like if he's given the loan or no, it's something that is objectively decided, whereas he would think that if a human being has done this, then maybe there are bias. So I don't know, this is like a broader example that goes beyond like cooperatives, just to show that like this idea of replacing like humans with like algorithms that would lead us into better and more objective ways of governance is like highly problematic.
I've just had a thought when you were giving out some of the examples, Natalia, which again has to do with measuring, how we measure and how we make decisions on our measurements of the world. So in a Daoist, and by this I mean Lao Tse Daoist, not decentralized autonomous organization sense, I would say that a lot of the technocratic solutions, they're map, but they're not territory. And I think that DisCO, in a more intuitive sense, deals more with the realities of the affective dimension, of the dimension that wants to escape from counting. And we do need to count. We need to strike this kind of like balance between magic and science, so we can have better conversations about the way we count and about the way that we create value, but stay in territory, not just default to maps which are cryptographically validated to the quark level. We could make a simulation of reality, and I'm sure that someone's thinking about this. Let's do a simulation which is validated by cryptographic contracts that just go like turtles all the way down, that go into the smallest components, and look out the window and check out the richness of life, and in this decaying world that we're living in, what do you take inspiration from? What are the kinds of things that feel right? And then I think that we can have more informed and mature discussions about how we measure, and about how we create like new institutions, because this is another danger. Is okay, if we are coming from socialism and we want to go to like upper stage communism, when does the withering of the state and the monetary system and class happen? When does the withering away of DAOs happen? Or how, if we do want to go, to a society from each according to the capacity, to each according to their need, when do we let go of the crutches? And a DAO could be a crutch towards that society. and start working. And again, I feel that a lot of the solutions proposed can be self-reinforcing and obfuscating some of the larger questions.
Yeah, I think those are really interesting points. I think sometimes when it comes to DAOs, or when it comes to the problem is when I talk about it, like I'm thinking of like four different definitions that I've heard it be described, and like depending on how wide or narrow you want to define it, it could be like very confusing. It's like some people will say, okay, this very large DeFi protocol for some, or decentralized exchange is a DAO because they have a token in which you can vote on governance. I think those are the people who you have the people who like really want everything to be DAOs. They really are like DAO hype men. They want to say no, it exists and it's like it's working. But then there are other people who say like no, this is just like token like allocated governance in which it is very very flawed. There are a lot of issues because if venture capital owns like half of your tokens and they just vote everything the way that they want to, then it doesn't it's not really truly decentralized. So I think a lot of it comes out of like the term decentralized or decentralization as being just an incredibly vague term that, in my opinion at least, I don't know if you agree, like I feel like it doesn't mean anything unless it is like couched in a lot of context. So I think a lot of people, they sort of, especially in the blockchain space, they talk about decentralization as being like an objectively good thing and something that needs to happen. But it is largely used as a way to sort of almost like project or like give a veneer of democratization, or I think that's what a lot of people want to, they want it to mean democratization when you say decentralization, but that isn't always the case. Especially when it comes to decentralized technology, sometimes you just mean that in a, we just have, now we have 100 computers holding up the network instead of just one. But anyways, that was a long rant. But yeah, I guess, where am I? Yeah, I guess if you could, I guess we talked about what DAOs are missing. Could you talk a bit about maybe like the cooperative principles within a DisCO? Because I think what has been really interesting, at least for me in the DAO space, is that a lot of people who are interested in DAOs have become very, very interested in cooperatives. Which is nice, I guess, but at the same time, I think there is a little bit of a misunderstanding of what a cooperative is. I think some people just believe that a DAO is automatically a cooperative, but I'm sure you guys would agree that's not exactly the case.
I sympathize with the feeling because I think that if the DAO space is going through adolescence or maybe post-pubescence, where the excitement of the possibilities has been shut down. Of course, cooperatives have a 175-year-old tradition of already existing economic distribution. But if you look at the humans, it's very different. There's 2.5 million cooperative societies with over 1 billion members, and that membership of the cooperative space is a lot less homogeneous than those engaging with the blockchains and DAOs. Cooperatives are spaces of economic mutuality and vulnerability, and they're often like constructed in a context of precarity and of scarcity. And again, I don't want to make like a caricature of blockchain bros, but there is a profile. And 96% of the Ethereum community, which is not the same as the DAO community, is men. And I think that it was like 80% is like it's white folks. So we're talking about decentralizing, etc. But are we talking about decentralizing power? And are we talking about offering access to people who may not think or sound like you? And over there, cooperatives, have a much better weathered track record. Also, cooperatives to me are a market formalization of the spirit of the commons, of commoning. But cooperatives have lost sight of the commons a little bit, and that's also one of the missions of DisCO. I mean, we're not perfect by any means, but we wanted to take DAOs to task based on our observations and to take cooperatives to task. But it's like when you have a cousin that you feel like, hey, let me just share some feelings with you, give you some provocations so we can do many exciting things, because co-ops are relevant and co-ops are exciting and DAOs are exciting. But it's not a match made in heaven, because they're very mismatched. And again, algorithmic structures are very different from legal structures. So we feel that DisCO can be a space of dialogue, but also a space of inclusion for those who may not resonate with DAOs or cooperatives, but do resonate with, like I say, it's the end of the world as we know it. What do we do? Hey, how about instead of like working for the man or giving your time away to a bullshit job, we do things that matter within trusted spaces of economic experimentation. I've been reading rest in peace, the latest book by David Graeber and David Wengrow, The Dawn of Everything, which talks, like anthropologically and archaeologically, how Homo sapiens squared have always had economic experimentation. So why did we get stuck in hierarchical systems? And I don't think that economic experimentation needs to be large scale. I think it needs to be practiced at the small scale and then figure out how we federate. But with those first-hand experiences, which are not just coached on cooperative principles and practices, but on the commons and feminist economics and all these notions of invisible value, which frankly, like, cannot be left out of the conversation any longer, especially if you're espousing, you know, the linguistics of being radical and reimagining value and economics. There's an economic tradition, there's ecological economics, there is feminist economics, and we need to engage with those, and it will just make for much better systems. I feel.
And it feels that it's the high time that, as Stacco said, like DAOs and cooperatives join forces, and it's not a match made in heaven, but it's been like this. This discussion has been cultivated for many years, like the last decade at least, of this discussion about like the commons communities as Ostrom described them, and the governance model they had, and then like the scalability of the digital commons, and then the whole tradition of cooperatives, and how are we going to find a way to bring all these alternative governance models together. And as I said before, and as as Taco clarified, there has been some gaps in the common space peer production and the way we understand commoning, because what Ostrom was referring to had to do a lot with physical resources and physical communities, and digital commons had like they scaled up into the infinity because of like the global like online communities. But still, like we haven't figured out a governance model that would give people like access to their means of the production, so access to owning like their platform and to be able to do commoning. So there has been like this discussion for quite a few years now, and I think it's high time to talk about it. And it's high time to talk about it because also like all these feminist voices in commons, feminist voices in hackerspaces, in digital commons, they need to join like the discussion equally, and actually like in a very foundational way, not just stakeholders into the discussion, because like if you do all these things from a feminist perspective, then you have to undo and redo.
Yeah, that's is very well said. One of the things that comes up in my mind as well about a criticism that I've heard before, especially around cooperatives, is that sometimes you have people who are also on the left who are very, very, let's say, doubtful of cooperatives as being a viable alternative to, yeah, I guess the current situation that we're in as like a vehicle for like any type of change. For example, Evgeny Morozov had that one tweet that became somewhat famous, and I think he doesn't like me, but he's these type of people who tend to be very, very critical of cooperatives and tend to think that what you're talking about they may agree with, but that the only way to achieve that is via really like ultimately what I think they're getting at is just a stronger state, or a state that is more willing to stand up against capital. So I'm wondering if you guys have any thoughts about that.
I mean, all power to the Soviets, right? And what happened after, 1925, 1926. So again, I mean, cooperatives to me are a system for topologies of like really decentralized and distributed economics. The leftist, the vanguardist, I would say, critique of cooperatives is nothing new. I mean, I'm going back to Marx. Marx called them like dwarfish forms. Engels was more chargeable to co-ops. But again, to me, that's kind of like an armchair critic kind of thing. Oh, cooperatives haven't succeeded. Well, neither did Marxist-Leninism in the face of a Cold War. You understand? There's always historical factors. Cooperatives do not have the economic incentives and help from the state that a company that is extracting oil from the earth does. We don't have the same tax breaks as corporations. We're very much bullied, and we're allowed to exist under this veneer of like, oh, cooperatives are like this traditional thing. No, they're very radical. I mean, just the fact of like taking worker ownership of the means of production, and that being the point of socialism. Hey, you're doing it with cooperatives, and to me, cooperatives are like, even though functioning within a capitalist economy, they're essentially anti-capitalist. And to Eugene's infamous tweet is again like history is written by the winners. So if we're criticizing cooperatives from the value metrics of the winners, yeah, of course they have failed. But there's 1 billion members. There's a turnover of like 3 trillion US dollars, etc. So, there could be an economic counterpower. What is lacking from cooperatives? What is lacking from cooperatives is a political consciousness of like how exciting and revolutionary they can be. And then there's the state intervention. But to me, the state intervention has to be by delegating powers. I mean, not to just like, okay, let's make these facilities public, take them away from private hands. It's like, no, let's practice radical economic subsidiarity and let's give them over to cooperatives. And not just to like any old cooperatives, but to cooperatives that uphold, for example, we would offer these 7 DisCO values, which incorporate all the feminist stuff, all the value tracking, the multi-stakeholder governance, and all the other stuff. This, to me, is a much more interesting Green New Deal than giving it away to like corporations or just substituting, the capitalism we know for a new updated version of state capitalism to face the climate emergency, because it's not going to work.
It's a very classical discussion, and whether like cooperatives are prefigurative politics, that they are just imaginaries for the future and like a bit utopic for the present, and so they kind of like act on a very symbolic level and not being viable, sustainable for the present. And there has been like a lot of leftist critique on cooperatives, but at the same time there has been a part of the left that has been supporting cooperatives, and in particularly the last decade within the emergence like them of the discussion around social solidarity economy, and that emergence happened due to the recession in the big countries. So what Stacco said is like, obviously, it's a very strange discussion and it comes up all the time. And a question is like, do cooperatives belong into the third sector? Like, because this is, for me, this is like the big question. So, what's the relationship of cooperatives like to the state and to the market? And do they want to like do partnership with the state, so to ask like more support from the state in order to convert the market, or they are in this third like place sector of the pie that is called like third sector and is more like social enterprises. So I don't know, Stacco covered everything. It's just, if there hasn't been like all this pressure of all these initiatives all these years, like there would haven't been any change into the EU policy. So if we have to talk like also about like EU, because we are based in EU, then there wouldn't have been this pressure, and then some of the policies wouldn't have been a bit more friendly to this initiative. So we can't really think when the big revolution will happen and when we'll take over, the state and the market. Like, we have to figure out our ways to build the initiatives, and at the same time to be able to ask like support, like from the state if it's needed. Because if the state was supporting cooperatives, as Taco said, then things would have been much more different in terms like of taxation, of outsource washing, like all these things. So
Yeah, I sometimes feel like a lot of those things are sort of discounted when talking about cooperatives, as if like I don't know, as if it was ever a fair match. Venture capitalist funded startup versus a cooperative. There's clearly like one has an advantage over the other in the current system, so you can't really like compare them apples for apples.
yeah, and obviously in a system that is kind of like giving priority into any structure that goes for profit, like obviously like cooperatives would start like from a very disadvantaged place, because like cooperatives give advantage and give importance to like the workers having their means of production. So like profit is redistributed within the cooperative. So it's not something that is the aim of and the end goal of this structure. So obviously, like it wouldn't be able to survive as easily as a big corporation, or even a very ambitious startup that aims for profit.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of these, I don't know, I guess I don't want to be too mean, but like nihilistic, a bit left wing critiques of like any specific thing. You could always substitute with, oh, cooperatives didn't do anything, oh, unions didn't do anything, oh, X didn't do anything, because like it's never going to be one thing that ever solves a problem, right? It's always going to be, various different strains of political movements that come together that then like have a larger force to make something. So it's like cooperatives with a very clear political message, with the help of unions, with the help of maybe politicians as well. Like, of course, that's what everyone would want. And so I find it sometimes silly to sort of denigrate one particular subsection of that as, I don't know, as a valid critique.
I was thinking when Natalia talked about like are cooperatives the third sector, both cooperatives and activism always get pushed into the place of the bronze medalist. So it's the third sector. There's two which are more important. There's non-profit, non-government, and like the commons is like it occupies this kind of like shady position of non-relevance, but they are relevant, and there's a lot of people working in co-ops. I mean, this is, the state is another theater of struggle. Labor unions, and in fact, in the UK, there's cooperative labor unions, are a very important another lever. We don't know what's going to work, but I can tell you, the more people that we have engaged with critical economics, with critical tech design, that know how to do the hard stuff, which is relating to each other as human beings before interacting with algorithms, the better that we will be prepared. The capitalist state is not interested in giving like a pedagogy of, which is non-patriarchal and decolonial, or indeed like critical of capitalism. How can we reimagine science? How can we reimagine work and production? So, I feel that it's our duty to these school people, but that usually has been the province of activism. And again, activism depends in if you have the time to practice activism, if you have that privilege, the same as engaging in DAOs. Most people have to work to pay the rent. So how can we reach like a compromise where you're actually doing a job and getting paid? And this is another thing. We feel that DisCOs is like a much more working class kind of structure, where DAOs would be more like a technological class kind of structure. If we have more people working on the things that matter, we will be much better prepared for rapid collapses and rapid shifts. Again, we would like to see a withering away of the state, a withering away of money. If we're already practicing like those relationships, we can look at what decommodifying certain areas of the economy look like. And to me, like this goes in a sense, I mean, in the more political sense, are like temporary autonomous zones of economic resistance that do have a foothold on the market through the cooperative structure, while we're trying out things with new ledgers, while we're trying out new ways of accounting, but also of relating to each other. And what does like the big DisCO future look like? To us, it's like more and more DisCOs, and we figure it out together. And and there's scope to talk about modularity and having like a shared lexicon, but also for widely different interpretations of what DisCOs are within those seven values, which are very political, according to your own specificity, according to your own circumstance, and from there draw inspiration, does the Eric Olin Wright thing, like, how to be an anti-capitalist in the 21st century. So, like, you can erode capitalism, you can retreat and go to the country, you can do try to do political change, or you can go for the revolution. And DisCO is kind of like combined like all four of those. Is you don't have to be set on one anti-capitalist strategy. You can be in this flexible place, and according to the political climate of the time, you can put your weight beneath, what may happen. I think that we're due for like a mass protest movement, much like Occupy, but with the learnings of Me Too, Black Lives Matter, etc., because things are not going well, and things are still not going to go well. And it would be exciting if that movement was not only working to break the glass ceiling of politics, but also to be working in distributed economics already. And to be working like, hey, we have people. What is the demand of the future? Well, the demand of the future is not going to be to exacerbate absentee shareholder value. The demand of the future is, sorry to be so blunt, is the fucking survival of the human species and the biosphere that sustains us. So if we have already people doing that kind of work, hey, at least we're creating capacity for whatever changes may happen. It's like you say, we don't know what's going to happen. So, again, being an armchair critic of the lack of success of cooperatives is like, well, are you a tenured professor that can make these critiques very much of hand, or are you part of the working class that you're supposedly advocating for?
Very well said. Maybe very quickly as well, I think it would be really interesting to hear from you guys because I believe both of you are working for as well with the Guerrilla Media Collective.
No, Stacco does.
I am.
Okay. I mean, I guess it would be interesting. I think just to like give an image of somebody to listeners, what it would be
Hello,
like,
listeners.
what it would look like if they were a part of a disco. What would maybe like their day look like, and maybe you can speak from some experience.
Sure. I can speak about Guerrilla, and Natalia, if you want to chime in. Natalia's been on a bunch of collectives which are disco-like also. In Guerrilla, I mean, we went through a lot of economic experimentation that we were baffled with and was hard, but the level of solidarity and the level of familiarity with concepts which may be alien to people has been really great. And in Guerrilla, it was basically like a place for activist freelance translators who were doing activism, post 15M Occupy, and having their day jobs as translators. And increasingly, we became able to derive more of our livelihood from the work that was being done in Guerrilla. And using the value flows is, we created a commons. We created a commons of pro bono translations, stuff that would not have been translated otherwise because no one would pay for it. You can find that in the Guerrilla translation web pages in Spanish and in English. There's a lot of articles, which, funnily enough, also they're like a chronicle of the political maturation of DisCO, because when you translate something, you really it's not just reading, it's like hyper intimate reading. Yeah, there's like a tactile wanting to commune with the language. So a lot of those the ideas that we were translated ended up in DisCO, and Guerrilla was very successful. We always had like more trouble with the economics and like incorporating the co-work than with like getting gigs. Guerrilla would get gigs straight away because there was something that appealed to people. And I think it's weird. We were talking about it recently. It's like we seem to be like really good at branding while being like totally anti-capitalist, but it's not branding. It's stimulating wants and desires. And capitalism is really good at stimulating wants and desires for shit that you don't need. But now I think that there's this huge anguish and like worldwide trauma in the midst of this pandemic that never ends, that things have to change. And I think that DisCO, just as Guerrilla did, has struck a chord with people. That there's a process of unfolding, understanding, but also finding out what it means to you. But aesthetically, it already feels fresh. It already feels like rebellious and punk-like, which is good because it's what I don't know. It's like a reflection of our personalities. The folks in Guerrilla and those of us that took DisCO. Day to day, you talk a lot, and you talk about like how you feel, not just what you're doing, and you talk about your values, and you become political because being political is fun. It's like we've abstracted like politics to this like dawa thing, and that's also one of the DisCO values. Is like these things are fun. Recreating economies are fun, and I don't know, at least in our experience, I'm very proud to say that we've formed some lasting friendships and true friendships, because true friendships is not just when things go well, when you're like really well funded and all your technocratic dreams shine away straight away. But when you go through difficulties, when you need to have the difficult conversations and you need to support each other, I think that this prepares us much better as human beings. And at the personal level, to me, it's been a deschooling, sympathizing with these principles, and then the hard work of enacting them, because it is hard work, because we're not educated for this. We're not educated to cooperate or to be commoners. But if no one's educating us for this, we better educate ourselves. And yes, make all sorts of mistakes, but as long as we document and open source them, we can at least find some new patterns. So it's not as hard.
Yeah, I was thinking the joyful militancy of Federici again, like how to bring joy again into politics. And I was also reflecting a bit on the discussion we are having. And I was thinking, how do we do politics nowadays? And that's the question. So, how do we do radical politics? And trying to figure out new ways to do radical politics without ignoring like the historicities of like specific movements, the common movement that goes much before the invention of the internet, obviously. And the what's the tradition of the cooperatives brought to us today, and also like how can we do politics within work, and like obviously we can unionize, but like how can we unstructure like our work? So it's like for me this is politics too, and we have to really unpack like all the categories and classifications of our lives and working lives till now in order to be able to articulate like politics as an experienced practice and not just as critical theory. So for me this is very important. um, yeah, I was engaged into bunch of collective the last years. I think I'd like to talk mostly about the last one, the most recent one, because it was formed during like the COVID period. And this meant a lot for us. And it's called Restorative Infrastructures. And it's a techno-feminist network. And we were people that we knew each other for years, but we physically met in 2019 in Berlin in a symposium, the Trans Feminist Hiking Symposium. And actually, we realized that it's high time to create a collective that tries to connect women and people from the LGBTQI community around the world. And we wanted to address like all the biases and all the problems that they have been you know, they have been invisible in the mainstream hacker spaces around the world and the digital commons like discussions and practices around the world. And we wanted to actually enact feminist to do it together pedagogies, and how can we talk and how can we practice intersectional learning. And the whole idea of the online and offline workshops during the COVID period, we are still struggling, and but we managed to bring together and to be connected with people that they are in Canada, they are in Cameroon. Stephanie Vutsis, who has the feminist hackerspace in Vienna, and we want to actually try to articulate a different way of doing technologies and open technologies, and we want to unblack box like all these like open technologies in a way that is kind of getting us back into the unlearning, the idea of like unlearning things, which is like very very foundational for feminists. So yes, and also like a project we did during COVID, which was collaborating with a makerspace in Athens, which was like very very small scale project, which ended up like donating 300 protective shields into the hospitals to medical personnel. So we managed to gather some money to buy the material and use the Prusa open prototype to do them protective shields. there. So to print them, to 3D print them in the pre-lab makerspace in Athens. So this was like a very small initiative, but I think that like these initiatives are very important and they work in prefigurative politics realm, but at the same time they need to federate and they need like a governance model in order to become like cooperatives, in order to be able to become sustainable. So for me, that's why I started like my sentence of how do we do politics. So it's how do we do politics nowadays? So how are we going to unstructure and restructure our work? So how are we going to join like our activist work with our actual work for livelihood? And this is a concern for people that they are most working class. This is not a concern for people that they want to just do high theory. So this is what DisCO addresses. And yes, in RI, restorative infrastructures, we are thinking of becoming a DisCO lab. So we are thinking to do this transition of like being a collective to being a DisCO lab, cooperative, and figuring out like governance model that will do this for us.
Nice. The impression that I get, if you're in a DisCO or want to make a DisCO and or want to start prefiguring your way to a DisCO or something, it would mean start talking a lot more probably to your coworkers, getting closer to them, being open about politics, all these different things that I think people are still, if you work in at least a normal traditional workplace, then like you are probably largely very alienated from your coworker and don't really want to talk about these things because it can make things complicated whenever you are working on something. But here in a DisCO, it's very different. We're overtly talking about politics and we're overtly sort of, I think, coming together. And in order to do that, you have to talk a lot more to each other and find ways that you can communicate with each other effectively.
Absolutely, and also care for each other, and don't just let the outputs of those conversations be kept to your particular DisCO or workplace. We're working on ways of doing mass documentation of this through semantic media wikis, and we will encourage like new DisCos to adopt semantic media wikis so we can actually have all these thriving laboratories of economic experimentation and to find the patterns. So like if you're based in Paris and you're working in this sector, maybe you find other folks which are near you doing this, and again, have fun. And no one is perfect. We cannot design. No one can see the future, but if we're a little bit more kind and we relate to each other and we can be like vulnerable, I think that I don't want to like make a pitch for productivity as it pertains to activism, because just productivity misses out on the whole relational aspect. But I think that talking to each other and being like much more political, in a fun, creative way, actually makes you a lot more effective, when you do need to do the productive stuff, because you're functioning as a unit that knows how to relate to each other as humans, not mediated through the algorithm. And I don't think we've mentioned this. One of the strong recommendations that we have is that you keep your DisCO to like 15 persons max, because you can have really meaningful relationships. 15 persons that you checking in with more often. This doesn't impede that you interface with DAOs, that you interface with other DisCos, but at a lower rate, but that you have a home to be in. And you can be a nomad, you can be a DisCO nomad, you can go from one DisCO to another, etc. This is a lot of the stuff that we're working in now to explore those possibilities and to offer a lexicon and a storytelling. But again, the people who are developing DisCos, we have our own experience, but we're a lot more interested in the experiences of other people. And what do I have to do? What do we have to do if we want to create a DisCO? Read the stuff, engage with us, and we'll be bringing out more and more resources to make it more off the shelf, to make it just to lay out the options, but also make it inclusive for people who may not come from a technological background to be able to engage with this in more intuitive ways.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I was going to ask you what should people do if they want to start a DisCO. But yeah, I think if you go to disco.coop, there is the manifesto there. I highly recommend reading it. It's very, very thorough. It provides a lot of context as to what perspective you are coming from when describing why a DisCO is important or why you decided to create it, and sort of what I think also very important, like earlier political traditions that are sort of you are borrowing from, let's say. Yeah, thanks so much to the both of you for coming on and talking about DisCO. I know people will be very, very interested in hearing about this. But maybe just the last thing, if you guys want, is there a place where people can keep up with you and your work?
DisCO.coop, which is our wonderful domain, and it's so easy to remember. You can graffiti it, you can write it on toilet walls if you want. If you do, thank you. There's a newsletter which is written by the DisCO CAT, and CAT stands for Community Algorithmic Trust, which is the driving factor of the technological design, which is maybe something that we can have another conversation further on about. And yeah, there will be lots of stuff coming out next year, but we're especially interested in hearing from the people that have already gone through the material and say, yeah, we want to try out how to become a DisCO and what it means to you, as a group. What is your interpretation, and contrasted with ours.
I try to avoid a bit social media and LinkedIn. I hate it. I have this big platform page, academia page. So actually, I can give yeah, my email will be on DisCO website. So it's just like they can get my email from DisCO website, and that's cool. If there is any question about like feminist economics and care work and all of these things, or we.
A big shout out to you and podcast, and we know that the audience in your Discord follows DisCos. So we were very excited, to talk to you and to talk to the community that you're forming. And it's very important to have like a critical vision of blockchains and DAOs, which does take into account this 175 to 200 years of political experimentation, which is also where we come from. So yeah, it feels homey to hang out with you.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, and yeah, really a pleasure to have you both, and yeah, I feel very fortunate to have had you guys on.